solve large, intractable problems.
It's a new venture altogether.
Your brain is a wild horse there.
Because remember, writing is not a team sport.
You are not selling horse carriages when there are cars.
I want to be known only as the trusted advisor.
More like a tourist.
Play to Potential podcast.
I've also been interested as a continuing thread on the business of things that are difficult to measure. And for governments, as we know, it's often very difficult for them to measure what they do and what the outcomes and outputs are. And so my interests in, as it were, the purely financial side gradually moved more and more towards thinking about what exactly are the outcomes here and how can we measure these. And on that theme of things that are difficult to measure, when I left the Treasury in 2004, I came back to the London Business School to work on an area which I would describe as things that are very difficult to measure. So I measured things like, how do we know that somebody on a board is successful, all the way to how do we know that that certain aspects of life are successful. I ran an elective here in which I challenged people not just to think about how they would measure what they did in their professional lives, but also in their personal lives. So that theme of difficult to measure is one that was a continuing thread. I then became dean, and so my research was interrupted. But when I was dean, I became fascinated by the idea that everybody talked about judgment as being a particularly important quality, but nobody knew, apparently, how to measure it. So I thought, this is something I would like to do when I finish being dean, and that's exactly what I've done. So that is the journey. Again, not exactly a straight line.
Welcome to the 60th conversation at the Play to Potential podcast. I'm your host Deepak Jayaraman, and I work with leaders as an executive coach, sounding board, or as a transition advisor as they navigate their journeys. The two questions I try and help leaders with are where to go and how to grow. I find that these two questions are quite parallel to the two questions businesses need to ask in the context of their strategy: where to play and how to win. In this podcast series, we feature conversations from leaders from different walks of life on three themes: leadership, transitions, and careers. Before I speak about the current guest at the podcast, I want to speak about a piece of feedback that I've received on the podcast. We started this podcast around 3 years back by talking about people's journeys and various transition points. Over time, we started talking to leading thinkers around the world on topics around leadership. Several people wrote back to say that it would be good to have a mix of insight from thinkers and insights from journeys. So moving forward, we'll also feature interesting journeys of individuals who've been thoughtful about their transitions. The next podcast will be with Atul Khatri, an accomplished stand-up comedian who used to run his own tech business and within a span of 7 years has moved from trying out at an open mic for the first time in his life in Feb 2012 to recording a Netflix special in Jan 2019, just in the span of 7 years. We speak about his journey, his midlife musings, and how he transitioned into his new trajectory. So do look out for that episode in a few weeks. But now, let's get back to the guest for this conversation, Sir Andrew Likierman. He's the former Dean of London Business School, and he's been studying judgment for several years now, and his work was recently published in the Harvard Business Review in the Jan-Feb 2020 edition, and was featured by The Economist in the recent edition dated July 18th, 2020. He was knighted in 2001 for his contribution towards streamlining the accounting of UK government finances. You would agree that good judgment underlies a lot of things that determine leadership effectiveness and our ability to lead a thoughtful and purposeful life. You would also agree that it's all the more critical in these times when there's so much chaos all around us. I first started exchanging notes with him on this topic about 4 years back when he visited Mumbai as a part of a fundraising tour for LBS when he was a dean. This conversation was recorded in 2 parts. About 90% of the conversation was recorded in Feb 2020, a few months back, when the world used to be a slightly different place. Given COVID-19, we decided to do a piece on his take on the role of judgment in these times, which you will find towards the end of the conversation. We first speak about some of his transitions and his arc of curiosity over time, and how he ended up studying judgment. But the bulk of the conversation revolves around a 6-step process that he advocates that could help us sharpen our muscle of judgment over time. Without further ado, let's dive into the conversation with Sir Andrew Likierman. Andrew, excited to have you at the Play to Potential podcast. Thanks for making the time.
Well, I must say I'm delighted to do this, and thank you very much for asking me.
Andrew, we'll get into judgment, which is the topic you've been studying for several months and years now, in a couple of minutes. But before that, in this podcast, I'm also curious about people's journeys and key pivotal moments in their journeys. I'm curious about your journey, Andrew. You qualified as a management accountant, then you ran a family business for a while, but then at some point moved to academia post that. Give us a sense of how you thought about these transitions as you took stock of your journey.
Well, one likes to think of one's life as being a kind of seamless continuity that has been well planned, but I cannot claim that. When I left university, I assumed that I would go into the family business. You kindly said I ran it. I didn't run it. My family, several members of my family were involved, and my father and his generation ran it when I was there. But my sense was that I would go into commercial life, and then my interest in academic life had been piqued by being at university, and so I hoped at some stage I might go into academic life. Well, to my great good fortune, the family business was bought out when I was in my 20s, and so I was able to go into academic life much earlier. And so what I've done is I've spent my life moving between commercial life, academic life, and government. The last one, rather unexpected, partly by a continuity of having financial expertise, but also, frankly, a matter of luck and chance.
Mm-hmm. And talk to us a little bit about your role in the government, Andrew.
Well, I specialised in the 1980s when I was here at the London Business School in government finance. I was interested in that. I thought it was an under-researched and under an area which had not very many people working in it. And I was intrigued by some of the issues which government faced. And so in the 1980s, I developed an expertise and did research in government finance. And as a result of that, in the early 1990s, I applied and got the job of the head of the Government Accountancy Service. So I spent 11 years then in the Treasury working on government finances and on a big project of moving government finance from a cash basis to an accruals basis, which was extremely complicated. And the whole project lasted for 9 years. So this was a very big event, a sense, in my life.
Got it. And back to your journey as an academic, Andrew, talk to us about what's been the arc of your curiosity. How have you studied different things, and give us a sense of how that's evolved over time and eventually leading up to you studying judgment?
Well, when I started out, I didn't know exactly what I was going to be working on. I was interested in certain aspects of financial management. But then as time went on, gradually, I moved more and more into the public sector area, and hence my interest that led up to my working for the government. But I've also been interested as a continuing thread on the business of things that are difficult to measure. And for governments, as we know, it's often very difficult for them to measure what they do and what the outcomes and outputs are. And so my interests in, as it were, the purely financial side gradually moved more and more towards thinking about what exactly are the outcomes here and how can we measure these. And on that theme of things that are difficult to measure, when I left the Treasury in 2004, I came back to the London Business School to work on an area which I would describe as things that are very difficult to measure. So I measured things like, how do we know that somebody on a board is successful, all the way to how do we know that that certain aspects of life are successful. I ran an elective here in which I challenged people not just to think about how they would measure what they did in their professional lives, but also in their personal lives. So that theme of difficult to measure is one that was a continuing thread. I then became dean, and so my research was interrupted. But when I was dean, I became fascinated by the idea that everybody talked about judgment as being a particularly important quality, but nobody knew, apparently, how to measure it. So I thought, this is something I would like to do when I finish being dean, and that's exactly what I've done. So that is the journey. Again, not exactly a straight line.
But it's lovely to see the way you frame it, Andrew, as focusing on things which are difficult to measure. It's an interesting frame in terms of where you divert your time and attention. But maybe moving to judgment now, for the purpose of the listeners, why don't we start by defining the term judgment? I see that this term is used in different contexts. It'll also help if you could share a little bit around the common misunderstandings or misinterpretations you see of the word.
Well, this is, I'm glad you came into that right at the very beginning, because it is a pretty critical element. And what I discovered, and one of the reasons, again, that my interest was aroused by this, is that there's no established definition of judgment in the context in which it's used, in many cases in professional life or indeed in personal life, though obviously that's less important for definition purposes. And I looked up very carefully how it's defined. Indeed, I looked up how it's defined in different languages to see if I could pin this down. And eventually I came up with a definition of my own, which is a composite of dictionary definitions and what I've heard and discussed. And it is the ability combining personal qualities with relevant experience and knowledge to form an opinion or take a decision. Now, that combination of the individual, the personal qualities, with the situational aspects, what I know about this that I'm looking at now or thinking about, and the experience I bring to bear, seems to be the critical element of judgment. Most often, I must tell you, when I talk to people about this, they say, before they've heard my definition or we've discussed definitions, they say, oh, well, judgment is really important, but it's not something I can define. But you know it when you see it. Now, that seems to me not quite good enough. If it's going to be so important, I think we need to pin it down. And in particular, if we try to get it better, we need to pin it down.
And maybe a related question, going back to your point about measuring things which are hard to measure. How do we you've defined what is judgment?
Yes.
Do you have any early thoughts on how we measure judgment?
Yes. What I've done is I've looked at the different elements that seem to make up judgment. This is to get round the business of saying, well, we can't define it, but we know it when we see it. And I've identified 6 that seem to me the key elements. So in brief, they are about learning. So it's, do we really listen when people are talking to us? And do we understand what we're reading? The second element is about the trust we place in individuals when we're seeking their advice or looking for information that we haven't got. And this might be, not just individuals, but also sources, because of course a lot of information comes from the web and so on. The third one is the experience we ourselves bring to a particular situation, whether we've done this before many times or a few times, and our understanding of of what that means in terms of our abilities to face a particular situation or deal with it. The fourth one is our ability to be detached from what we're looking at or deciding on. That's to say, when we come to anything, we have our beliefs and our views. We need to know what those are to make sure we can take those into account when we make our choice about what to do. I'm not saying that, it's possible, and I'm sure it's not possible for us to distance ourselves from all of those, but we need at least to identify them. And with those four, we go into the question of making a choice, looking at the options, and the way in which we do that is important to our judgment. And finally, there's the question, having made a choice, the question is, can we actually deliver it? Is it possible to execute this choice we've made? Because it's all very well saying this is a great idea in theory, but a good judgment also means being feasible in practice. So in brief, those are the 6 elements.
And that's great. And maybe talking a little bit about how you got here, Andrew. We'll dive into each of these 6 in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
But if you could comment on, how these 6 buckets evolved over time. Did you have to chop and change, or are there things that you worked with for a while but had to drop off? Could you talk a little bit about how you got here?
Yes, well, it's a very unconventional piece of research. I've never done anything quite like this before, because what I was starting with is a completely blank sheet, in essence. I looked at a lot of the literature. I looked at the way in which other people had addressed this issue. And it didn't seem to me there was the combination of factors that satisfied me that I could say, this looks like together, this looks like judgment. So the method was to read a lot. I went into many literatures, and in academic life that's tough because one literature is bad enough. I must have gone through at least 10 literatures in many different subjects. I talked to a lot of people. I quizzed them about what they thought about this, how they made their choices, what went through their minds. And I talked to people in many different walks of life, and many different levels, and also at the end in many different countries, to try and bring these together. And I was conscious of the fact that this was a list that was very difficult to bring together, and I did it therefore quite cautiously. And certain things I felt, for example, I just give you one example, should one include execution and delivery at the end by number 6 in this? Because you could argue maybe judgment finishes with choice and options one's looked at. But actually, it seemed to me that if people made choices that were only good in theory, as I said, that couldn't be a good judgment. The other 2 elements I just mentioned are risk and timing, because you could argue that 7 and 8 would be risk and timing. But risk is actually very much part of all of the elements I've described. One has to take into account risk at every stage, all the way from how good one thinks the information is, all the way through to delivery. And so I thought that was something that was not a separate element, it was something that was part of everything. And timing, that again is part of several different elements, particularly in terms of the question of choice and delivery. So those are the kinds of things. I mean, I won't go through the very many stages that I went through to come to this. But one of the things, can I just say, one of the things which I continue to say now, even after I've been working on this for such a time, is if anybody's got any ideas about, why this is wrong and if there's anything else I should be considering, I'm very open to ideas, because I'm conscious of the fact I may simply have missed things, and I'm still very interested in what people have to offer in terms of this particular framework.
Got it. The reason I asked the question, Andrew, was I think when we met in Mumbai about 2-3 years back, and subsequently when we caught up in London last summer, we spoke about one of the dimensions, which was values. I remember you talking about the values of a leader as being a consideration at some point, but later I think, I see you talking about detachment, which I get a sense that you talk about the fact that you need to recognize what your values are and ensure that, you're detached from it rather than being consumed by it. Is that a fair understanding of how your thinking has evolved?
That's absolutely right, Deepak. And I very much valued our discussions on this. And I know that was something that you felt was particularly important. And I did think long and hard about this in terms of how I approached values. My sense was that the detachment element did not mean, as I said in my introduction, that one should be detached in a sense of being remote from the way one looks at something, but very much aware of the beliefs and values one brings to a particular choice. And one may decide, for example, that one excludes very large numbers of possibilities because of the values that one holds. And that is very much then about understanding that, because I'm sure you and I and anybody listening to this will know that there can be occasions when values collide and people have very different values, and actually the discussion is about different values. So for me, what's important here is to get the values out into the open so that everybody understands where they are. And if there's disagreement about values, we understand that that is the subject of the disagreement and not facts or interpretations and so on.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense, Andrew. The one thing that's worth noticing is that the nature of judgment we need to exercise in one context might be very different from the judgment we need to show in a different context. For instance, Rupa Kudva speaks about how she had to fine-tune her judgment muscle given her move from CRISIL to Omidyar Network.
I think there's a difference in judgment as a business leader when you are taking business decisions for a business that you are running yourself, compared with judgment as an investor. I think you're one step removed because you're making a judgment about an entrepreneur who in turn has to make judgments about businesses in areas where there is not much data, which are at the frontier of innovation. And so that makes it increasingly, makes it harder in a sense. I feel though that early stage investing is about thinking of the possibilities and figuring out the possibilities and applying judgment to what is the type of business and will this business model and will this entrepreneur succeed. I think that's the judgment we are making. In a rating decision, the judgment is about the risk, what could go wrong in a sense. And in running a company, the judgments involved are a different set of judgments altogether. It's about, competitive strategy, it's about positioning, it's about new products, and things like that. So I think the judgments are in three different contexts in that sense. In investing, I feel that initially understanding the world of the startup entrepreneur was important for me to kind of learn how to think as an investor. I think that was the most important part. In terms of commercial understanding of businesses and how the economics of a business work, I think that was less challenging really. It was more about how the world of technology is evolving and what are these new age entrepreneurs like. I think developing that understanding, I think, was the learning curve.
As leaders transition context, whether inside an organization or otherwise, it's helpful to see how we keep sharpening our judgment muscle to ensure that it's fit for purpose in the new context. A quick request at this stage. If you find this podcast of value, do take a moment to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform where you consume the content. This small act of yours will help in two ways. It will help more people discover this podcast amidst the ocean of content that's out there. And secondly, it will help us raise the bar by getting great speakers who look at these metrics to see if this podcast is worth their time. Now, let's get back to the conversation with Sir Andrew Likierman. Let's dive into the six themes you talk about. The first one you say is learning, and you say it's about listening attentively and about reading critically. Especially in the world we live in, where there's a deluge of information, given multiple, media streams and all kinds of noise in the information that we see. What are some of the things you've seen effective leaders do in the way they manage their time and attention, and in ensuring that they're working on quality information?
Well, a theme that's come up again and again, and one reads it in the press about leaders, is about the way in which they listen to people. I'm sure, again, we've all had experience of people who run organizations who have long ago given up listening. They are mainly interested in explaining their own views and not at all interested in other people's. And this seems to me a dangerous element, because all one then does is just listen to one's own views all the time. And the world moves on. And yesterday's truths are not necessarily applicable. Yesterday's situation is not necessarily applicable today. So that's one element. And the other element is, I've noticed the fact that people often, if you give them a document, have not read the document. They don't know what's in it. And so they're then relying on somebody to come along and explain to them, not even just to explain to them, because then they don't feel it deserves the time to look at the document. They then rely on interpretation, somebody else's interpretation of the document. And that again seems to me hazardous. So in a sense, it's about the quality of the inputs, of making sure that one has actually understood what the raw material is that one's getting. And that is very much, seems to me, part of what will greatly help somebody's judgment.
Got it. And I think in the article you say, if you're overwhelmed by the written briefing material, focus on the part that discusses questions rather than those that summarize a presentation. Right? I guess that speaks to that same insight.
Yes. And I've been involved in a number of boards where the volume of material is absolutely overwhelming. You require hours and hours to go through this in detail. And we're human. It's very difficult to spend enormous amounts of time on that kind of activity. And so one of the key elements, it seems to me, is to say, all right, if I am overwhelmed by this, what are the key elements I really, really must read? And rather than simply saying, well, I won't bother, or I'll just skim it somehow and therefore not take much in, my suggestion is to go to the key elements, the key questions, and say, what are these? And then make sure, for example, as a board member, that you ask the presenter to elucidate those to you if you haven't got them from the papers. So that would be an example.
The point Andrew makes around listening is a profound one. There are different levels of listening that we can aspire to. Among the leaders I work with, I often find that they're so consumed in doing things and filling their calendars that they're left with very limited mind space and horsepower to process what's going on. Vinay Sitapati, the author of Half Lion, a biography of our former Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, speaks about Narasimha Rao's reflection habit and his ability to sift signal from the noise.
And Narasimha Rao's ability to be introspected, to be inward, helped him sift the day into what, or to put it in statistical terms, to be able to sift the signal from the noise. So I think that's the first thing that introspection taught him, that, one is it taught him don't trust anyone except your diary, which is a pretty good skill in politics. Second is that you should be able to sift the signal from the noise. Who are the people you met every day? How many people are being honest?
how many people are lying. To give you just one example, one of the diary entries which I have in the book is from 22nd May 1991. Right? This is the day after Rajiv Gandhi has been killed in near Chennai, and Narasimha Rao, who until then had been basically eased out of the Congress and was about to become a monk in a monastery called Kotralam in Tamil Nadu, and was closing his bank accounts, is suddenly realizing that by virtue of being the least ambitious man in the party, he's primed to be Prime Minister of India, right? And the diary shows, 22nd May, he's back in Delhi, he's in 10 Janpat, where Sonia Gandhi and Rajiv used to live. And, pieces of Rajiv Gandhi's body, they're just pieces, they're not the full body, are kept there, and all the congressmen are around the body pretending to cry. Some of them actually crying, while actually trying to maneuver to see who would succeed him. And he has this wonderful passage about how Pranab Mukherjee, who was in the boondocks then, but would later recover to become President of India, wheedles up to him and says, we think you should become Congress President, which is the proxy for Prime Minister of India. And Narasimha Rao immediately says, I immediately told him that, that it was, that I'm not the right person, right? Knowing full well the kind of person he is. I also gave him the name of N.D. Tiwari for Prime Minister of India, knowing that he was even less likely a candidate than I am, right? And I think the introspection in the diary allows him to do that. It allows him to reflect over the day. Otherwise, think of it. Somebody else Pranab Mukherjee came up to me and says, maybe you should be Prime Minister of India. I wouldn't stop to ask what's his anger, right? So I think the introspection gave him that ability.
At senior levels, I guess it's critical to find your mechanism to look for the signal from the noise around you. I hope you're deriving value from the podcast. If so, I would urge you to take a moment and consider paying it forward to Antarang Foundation, an organization I work with closely. To know more, please visit playitopotential.com/payitforward. PAYITFORWARD. Now, let's get back to the conversation with Sir Andrew Likierman. And moving to the second one, Andrew, trust. There you say you talk about seeking diversity and not validation. And when I read the HBR article, I found you referring to Abraham Lincoln as an individual who proactively sought diverse perspectives when he made decisions. Could you talk a little bit about what we can learn from the way he went about soliciting diverse views and making good decisions?
Well, what he did was that, and this is set out very interestingly in a biography which I read, he brought together people who he felt did represent a different set of views, and one, therefore, where discussion and conflict could give rise to a better choice at the end. Now, most people wouldn't necessarily choose this route, and I know myself from having run more than one organization or one part of an organization, that often one likes to have people around one who, frankly, agree with one. And, it's a much more comforting business to have people who chime into what one says and agree and so on. But actually, then one doesn't often get the kind of challenge that a point of view needs before it can be passed through and go to an informed choice. And there's the famous case of Alfred P. Sloan at General Motors, when people when people agreed to an item on the agenda around the board table, asked people to go away and think about it, and then come back to the next meeting so that somebody could present an alternative, so that they could at least discuss it. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a very good use of everybody's time, but just let me give you an example of something that I've done here, which is, and that happens particularly if people are somehow afraid to speak up, to say, I'd like to name somebody, just to put the alternative view so that we've heard it. Now, that might give somebody courage, as it were, to put forward a view that they have without feeling that they are causing a problem in terms of their own position in disagreeing with the majority of people in the room.
Interesting. It's like giving them a license to disagree. Exactly.
And that's important, particularly in cultures where disagreement particularly with hierarchies, is not encouraged.
Interesting. And in this section, you also go on to say that outcomes are not a good proxy for good judgment. As I was sort of reflecting on it, the question that occurred to me was, if that's the case, then how do you discern an individual's quality of judgment? Back to the point around measurement. If outcomes aren't a good proxy, then how do we, over time, come to the view that somebody has a good judgment or a poor sense of judgment?
Well, this is obviously a very important element, because in most cases in life, we do look at outcomes to say, well, has somebody been successful? Has this line of thinking been successful? In general, has this been a good thing to do or a bad thing to do? The difficulty with judgment is that life is not within one's own control. I mean, the fact is, you can make a perfectly good judgment, and circumstances may mean that you don't succeed. Similarly, to be blunt, you can make a rather poor judgment and be saved by luck. That's one element. There's another element, which is that it may look as if something's successful, but actually it turns out later that it isn't at all successful, but at the time we didn't know that. So the question is, when do we look at the moment at which something appears to be successful? I took the example of Theranos, the startup in California, which claimed that blood tests could be done from the single drop of blood from a finger. And this was a company valued at one day at $9 billion, and the next day at nothing, because it was seen to be a fraud. Now, until the moment at which that fraud was discovered, this looked like a great success story. There's a timing issue here too. And then we don't know what the counterfactual is. We never know, in terms of an outcome, what might have happened if we'd done something else. Now, these are some of the reasons why it doesn't seem to me that looking at outcomes alone is good enough for judgment. And so what I suggest is one has to go back and say, did the person or the group do the right things in order to achieve this, in order to make their choice? If they did the right things, including, for example, looking at the way they treat risk, if they do the right things, then the judgment has been fine. Thereafter, we don't know what will happen, because they may be affected by many other factors. And I'm just being realistic here in terms of saying this is about a process and not about outcomes. Now, of course, I believe that if one makes good judgments, more often than not, and hopefully far more often than if one doesn't to go through the process, one will have a good outcome. But those are some of the reasons why I think it's hazardous to talk about the link between judgment and outcome.
Got it. I guess the other piece on my mind, Andrew, was in a way, if we look at the 70s and the 80s and the Alfred Sloan context, there was a little bit of certainty around the nature of the business topics. There were unknowns, but the technologies were more predictable. A lot of things were in the realm of knowing. I guess in the digital age, if we look at a Google, somebody who's heading Google, someone like a Sundar Pichai or a Satya Nadella heading Microsoft, I guess there is a lot of unknowns, and it's possibly even information asymmetry between the leader and the person reporting into the leader. So I was just curious if you see a distinction in the way judgment plays out in these different contexts.
Yes, we know just how difficult it is, especially in the context of the development of AI, to be able to predict a lot of things. But the world has always been a pretty uncertain place. I think, often people look back and say, oh, well, it was easier before, it was a kind of golden age when everything looked pretty stable. Well, in every age, people look back for this mythical golden age when everything was stable. And it's very interesting how, people rewrite, in a sense, periods of great change as periods of great stability, because that's how they look in retrospect. So I don't think there is a sort of quantum leap here. One thinks about the Industrial Revolution, one thinks about developments of transport. I mean, these have been absolutely huge over the last couple of 100 years, and people have had to adapt to very different circumstances. But the quality which says, I am taking things in and I am got an open mind, seems to me pretty universally applicable. The person who approaches things with a closed mind, even in a period of apparent stability, is somebody who's not actually the right person to be in charge of an organization with a lot of people in it, certainly not a commercial one.
Got it. And back to the point around experience, Andrew, I'm also curious about the role of age. I guess going by what you say, there's something to be said about cumulative years of experience, having, taken some decisions, seeing those play out, and sort of let that inform your intuition. So intuitively, one would assume that the more time that elapses, therefore better the judgment. How do you did you see a pattern between age and the way and the quality of the judgment as leaders evolve?
Yes, I do. And again, this seems to me one of the most important things that one can learn about judgment, including for oneself, that one gains, of course, if one thinks about a working life, one gains experience, and therefore one has more and more context to put one's judgments in. And that experience should enable one over time to have better and better judgment. And my belief is that if one goes on learning through one's life, then one's judgment should keep on improving. Now, my experience has been that very often people, when they achieve power, when they are perhaps very sure of themselves, their judgment starts to get worse because they don't listen anymore and they believe that they are pretty important people, they are pretty good people, and they don't really need to learn very much. And therefore, their judgment actually gets worse. And we've seen, I know, people will have had experience of those who, in positions of authority, actually make very bad decisions because their judgment has got worse. And I think that's something we can all think about in terms of our progression through our working lives.
Got it. And on a related note, Andrew, you talk about leaders sort of taking stock of the key judgment calls they take to identify what went well and what went badly. To make it tactical for the listeners, what are some of the behaviors or small habits or things that you see people do to keep a record of the various judgment calls they're making? How do leaders, what sorts of report cards do they use for themselves as they take stock of the quality of judgment over time?
I've got an example from commercial life, or rather, it's somebody who's involved in a government department here, who said at the end of every week, she sat down and wrote down the major decisions she'd made in the week. And this was before she hadn't read anything that I'd written, but I would happen to be talking to her, and she gave me this example. And she reflected at the end of the week. It just took, she said, about 15 minutes to say, all right, so what did I do then? And how did it go? And do I regret that? Now, she said, all right, end of the week is a bit short term. You haven't got the answers, but at least it gives you some way to look back on that. Some people, of course, look back at the end of a year and do things like that. Some people take a longer period. The one difficulty about this is that you don't have on this list the things that you didn't do. So you only have the things that you did do. And on reflection, that's something which I'm still having to think how to cope with that. But those are the kinds of examples one has to allow the benefit of reflection from what one has done. And I think that's something where one can learn all the time.
It's interesting to hear Andrew talk about a reflection habit where we take stock of our judgment calls. I remember reading that Jack Welch would keep a close track of his hiring batting average and the people around him. By doing that, I read that his miss-hire rate came down from 60% to a game-changing 20%. The other interesting point Andrew makes is that when we reflect on the choices we have made, we only think about the commissions and not necessarily the omissions. And research has shown that over the long term, we regret our omissions much more than our commissions. Jeff Bezos, in a similar vein, speaks about the notion of regret minimization framework as a way of making a choice. This is also a good time to bring in an insight from another guest in the podcast, Tasha Eurich. Tasha is an organizational psychologist, and she studied the phenomenon of self-awareness for several years now. She speaks about the nature of reflection we need to undertake and warns us against getting into what she calls the rabbit hole of rumination.
So we surveyed about 300 people and we asked them, how much time do you spend introspecting? In other words, kind of pondering the deeper meaning behind our thoughts and our feelings and our motives. And then we surveyed them on things like, are you stressed? Are you depressed? Are you anxious? Are you happy? Do you like your job? Are you happy with your relationships? Do you feel in control of your life? And naturally, because self-awareness is good, I knew that we would find that the more people introspected, the better off they'd be. And that was the opposite of what our data showed. So we found that people who self-reflected often were more anxious, more stressed, more depressed, less satisfied with their jobs and their relationships. They were even less in control of their lives. And we're just sitting there going, oh my gosh, maybe self-awareness is bad, right? Maybe delusion is actually what we want to be fostering, because this doesn't seem like it makes sense. And as we started to dig into some of the data, we started to discover that thankfully, it's not that introspection in and of itself is bad. It's just that the way most of us introspect is completely wrong. And the best way to illustrate this, again, without having 2 hours to delve into it, is to think about probably what the most common introspective question is for most people, which is the question, why? So we might be trying to understand why we're in a bad mood. You could say, why am I so upset after that conversation with my coworker? Or we might be trying to understand a bad outcome, like, why didn't I get that promotion? Or we might be even trying to understand why we believe what we believe. Why do I want that promotion? But as it turns out, those questions, not only do they lead us away from true insight about ourselves, they give us a false sense of confidence about our knowledge. So, for example, Sigmund Freud was wrong. He believed in his work that people could access their unconscious, right? So like, really, why am I upset? If I just excavate, if I just think long and hard and ask that why question, I can find the answer. But what research has shown for decades actually is that no matter how hard we try, we can't access so many of those things. It's what I mentioned earlier about the behavior and emotion and knowledge blindness. Mm-hmm. So what happens is we find an answer that feels true, even if it's wrong. So that's an example of where it can lead us away from the truth rather than towards it. Another reason why is a really dangerous question introspectively is it has been shown over and over and over to depress us. You think about it like, why didn't I get that promotion? If you're not careful, you can start asking questions where the answers are, well, because I'm just a fundamentally bad person and who would want to promote me? And you can kind of get stuck in, I call it the rabbit hole of rumination. And so what we wanted to do in our study was understand, okay, if why is the wrong question, what is the right question? What are these unicorns doing differently than the rest of us? And it took us a little while to find this pattern, but we discovered that when unicorns introspected, they almost never asked why questions. They asked what questions. And at first I thought like, oh, that's just a weird sort of fluke or a weird nuance. But as we started to look into it, it started to make a huge amount of sense. So one example would be, going back to the question, why didn't I get that promotion? Unicorns, if they were in that situation, wouldn't ask themselves that question. Here's some questions they might have asked instead. What did I learn that can help me be better positioned in the future? Or what can I do to close the gap between, where I thought I was and where I need to be? Or what support can I enlist from the people around me to help me, achieve this goal the next time I set it? Or going back to why am I so upset about that conversation with my coworker? They might instead ask, well, what part of that situation did I own? Or what can I do differently in the future to avoid that kind of conversation with that person? And so what we found was asking what instead of why really helps us avoid so many of the pitfalls of introspection, where we're excavating for the truth that we're never going to find, and we're focusing on our problems and feeling victimized and disempowered.
Bringing it back to what Andrew said, while we need to find a way of keeping track of our run rate, it's critical for us not to overanalyze the why in the short term, because it might take much longer for the effects of the choice to play out. A quick reminder at this stage, if you find this podcast of value, do take a moment to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform where you consume the content. This will help us keep raising the bar in this series. Now, let's get back to the conversation with Sir Andrew Likierman. Let's move to the next one, Andrew, which is detachment. Right? You talk about identifying and then challenging the biases. And you talk about two types of detachment, emotional and intellectual. Talk to us about what you mean by each of these and how leaders could address these.
Well, this comes back to your earlier comment about the role of values. This is also heavily involved in this area. So emotional detachment, I hope we can all recognize this. We approach many issues, most issues arguably, with an emotional viewpoint. We either like or don't like somebody. We like or don't like an issue. We feel about things. We don't just approach as automatons. And it's important, I think, to understand exactly where one is with this. If I just give an example, somebody might ring you up and say, can I talk to you about so-and-so? And your reaction might well be, subconsciously, I don't actually like this person, and I don't think I want to do this, but nevertheless, I'm going to listen politely. Or they might be, oh, I'm so pleased to hear this person. I'm looking forward to what they've got to say. One starts off with lots of emotional views about people and about issues. On the intellectual side, one approaches things knowing what one knows, and one has facts, one has experience, and so on. And you can be honest. I mean, there's in terms of saying, well, am I looking at all the facts here, and am I looking at all the arguments in a way that is analytic, is detached analytically, or am I just getting around that and ignoring that? So I think these are the two elements here, the emotional and the intellectual. And I believe we approach every choice, even quite trivial ones, with both these things being relevant.
Once again, like the last time, to make it tactical for the listeners, could you talk a little bit about a few things that you see effective leaders do to ensure that their biases don't come in the way of a decision?
Yes, I talked to one company, and this is an extreme example, where people were encouraged before a key discussion to declare their biases. In other words, to say, look, I come to this, I've been working on this for 5 years. Of course, I believe this is a great project, so I just want to let you know that before I start. Whereas somebody else might say, coming from finance, say, well, this looks terribly expensive to me, and I don't think we've got the resources. So my immediate reaction to this was, well, actually, I don't think this is a very good idea because I don't think we can do it. Now, I think that's remarkable in a way. It's a well-known company. I'm not able to quote it, but everybody's heard of the company. But I think that's a very interesting idea. most often and more usually, if we talk about, for example, a discussion between different functions, you would expect the marketing function to look at marketing aspects, to say, well, look, I think we can do this, I think we can do that, this is a great opportunity, and so on. And, you know, in one sense, everybody around the table says, oh, that's marketing. Of course, they would say that, wouldn't they? In the same way as they might say, well, finance is always conservative and they don't like taking risks and so on. So I think that somebody who is in the business of saying, I'll gather views around me, has to know where everybody's coming from so that they understand that what is said is not said necessarily at face value, but is coloured by the biases that they have. And so it's not just words, as it were, that matter. It's also the sentiments behind the words that I think somebody who's getting to grips with what's relevant for this particular choice has to do. I mean, if I just take, I'm steering well clear of politics here, but I think we all know that when a politician in any country says something, there is an agenda there. You know what I mean? Politicians, in general, talk because they believe in a set of ideals and ideas, and we understand that. And so, after a while, we get to know where their biases are, and we take account of that. Of course, if we agree with them, they think it's wonderful. But anyway, that's a different matter.
And given you're based in London, I can't not ask you this question. What's your take on the way Brexit has played out, if you apply the lens of getting to a good judgment?
Well, I think I would say Brexit is a brilliant example where very little judgment is involved. I would say in my six areas, that very little is in evidence. People are not listening to what's going on. Nobody really trusts anybody in this area. You know, we've never had Brexit before, so it's all completely new. So it's all a matter of complete conjecture. You can say anything you like and be confident that you won't have to live with the consequences. People are not at all detached. The choices are very stark for an incredibly complicated question. So it's yes or no to many different issues. Now, I have an interest here. I am adamantly anti-Brexit, so there you are. Like everybody else, I have a strong view.
Got it. I think moving from detachment to options, Andrew, you talk about questioning the solution set that's being offered, and you use the phrase not being boxed by the way things are presented to you. Talk to us a little bit about what that means and how that shows up in leaders' lives.
Well, very often leaders are faced with choices presented to them, which are, you can do this or this. Sometimes it's, you can do this or this or this, and the indication is, well, the middle one is actually the one which we're steering you towards. Sometimes they only are given one option. Now, in all these cases, I think somebody who's running an organization has got to ask the question, have I been given all the options? And in particular, for example, do I understand how risk plays out in these options? So simply being presented, what I meant by not being boxed in is, if you are presented with two options and you feel there are more options, then you should be asking for more options, not just simply accepting there are only two options because that's what has been presented to you. Sometimes it may be that you say, we're not going to take any of these options because we haven't got certain important facts and we need to think again, go away and look at it again. So there's another option, which is do nothing at this stage. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that there should always be delay, because in some cases, delay is disastrous. And there may be, in that sense, you may be boxed in because you can see that if you wait for another 10 minutes or a day or a week, then matters will be outside your control. You will have taken a bad decision by taking no decision. But what I meant, therefore, is that leaders ought to make sure that when options come to them, they are careful that these are not the only options available.
Do you have an insight on when you've sort of fleshed out the different possibilities? Is there anything empirical you found there?
This is so context specific. It's quite difficult to give instances. I can just think of many examples in my professional life where people have not thought about all the possible options. And actually, if you think about it, this is one reason why you have decisions brought to a committee, so that you have a different lens and different viewpoints brought to bear on a particular possibility. So it seems to me here that there should be the check there, because the people who are working on something themselves may be so blinded to the alternatives and go down firmly say these are the only options. But a board, for example, at its best, will include people who say, have you thought about this? Particularly if they've seen something in a different context which says, well, actually, somebody tackled this a completely different way. So I'm not saying that self-editing is always intentional. It may be unintentional. And I think the good leader will be someone who has established the fact that this has gone through enough scrutiny to make sure that, the options have been considered. And one doesn't say afterwards, I wish we'd thought about that.
Got it. I'm reminded of my visiting a coffee shop in London a few years back. I remember it was a busy winter day at work, and I stepped out to get some fresh air and some coffee. And this was not one of the chains like Starbucks or Costa's where I knew the drill. This was a boutique coffee shop. And a lady at the counter asked me what drink I would like. I asked for a cappuccino. Then she said what size I would like, medium or large. I said medium, paid the money, picked up the coffee and walked back to the office. And at that point, I told myself, hang on, was there a small size in the menu? Then quickly, just to check, I walked back, and as expected, there was very much a small option on the menu. It's just that the lady didn't offer it to me, and it didn't even occur to me that I should ask. In the work I do, I see several leaders in transition fall into this trap. That's possibly because the options don't line up concurrently. The option that might make the most sense for you might emerge a few weeks or months down the line if you persist. But if you might see a couple of attractive options ahead of you today, you might end up picking from those. And this phenomenon is explained very well by Herminia Ibarra, another professor at London Business School, who speaks about the risk of foreclosure when we are in transition, the risk of closing our doors too soon to options.
See, when you're making a transition, people think you go from A to B, but you don't. You go from A to this transition thing, which we call liminality in our technical jargon, to B. Mm-hmm. So in between, you're neither here nor there, and it's horrible because you lose your identity anchors. And so in that space, it behooves you to be a little bit more playful because you're neither here nor there. So that means you don't have to be consistent, and you can try and you can talk to people about jobs you'd never consider, or you can do things that are pretty much out of character, but you're trying to learn something. And that can be very freeing because we don't often give ourselves permission to deviate.
There are no corporate guidelines.
No. And so the two principles are, as you said, divergent exploration and delayed commitment. Divergent explorations is, what I mean by that is, whenever I teach people who are in transitions, one of the first things I do is I say, write a list of your possible selves. They don't have to be feasible, they don't have to be public, they don't have to be something you're committing to do, but just let your imagination run wild. What's the set of possibilities? Do a kind of brainstorming with yourself. Don't be embarrassed to write, even if it's ridiculous, put it in there. And it's really interesting what people come up with. It's quite, in fact, we are very multiple and often quite divergent. Doesn't mean you're going to do all of those things, and certainly not at the same time. But when you get permission to be divergent, there's a lot there. And in fact, one of the things that is hard for people in transition is they feel that they must not be ready because they're considering such a different array of options. And they feel that somehow that's wrong, that they are equally passionate and excited about two things that seem mutually exclusive, like getting promoted at my current firm and then starting up a business on something completely different. And one day you're excited about this and the other day you're excited about that, and you think you're out of your mind. But in fact, what we're doing is trying to explore and compare and contrast, and how do I feel here and how did I feel there? And so when you give yourself, and that's why it takes time, that's why the time factor plays in, to explore more divergently and say, this is actually natural and it gives me more information so that then I can make the right choice. You make better decisions and you're less likely to do the other thing, the foreclosure, which is take the first thing that comes your way because it's been 6 months and I can't tell people anymore that I'm still, out of work. And so the delayed commitment comes from understanding that it's going to take time and you're not going to go for the first thing that comes up or the second thing until you've really had a chance to test. Because once you jump, you're going to be stuck there at least another 2 years. And so why not take a little longer at the beginning in order to make a more robust choice?
Ensuring that we are making a decision from the right menu card of options is critical, especially in high-stakes situations where the options show up asynchronously. If this topic is of interest, you might like a recent LinkedIn article that I published, titled, "Are You Seeing What's Not Visible?" where I talk about this in a little more detail. Thank you for listening. If this topic is of interest, you might like the playlist Judgment, where we have insights from leaders from across domains speak about their take on the topic. This ranges across Zia Modi, who speaks about judgment in a legal context, Amit Chandra, who talks about judgment in investing, Vinay Sitapati, who speaks about Narasimha Rao's sense of judgment, Dr. Ramachandra Guha, who speaks about Gandhiji's sense of judgment when he took big calls, and so on. To access this, please go to playtopotential.com/tags/judgment. And the last piece you talk about, Andrew, is the point around feasibility of execution. And you talk about leaders not getting carried away by the exuberance of the imaginative kinds and ensure that they run a checklist of pragmatic things while evaluating an option. And once again, bringing it to the tactical realm, any insights from the conversations you've had on what leaders do to run through this?
Yes, I've been involved in a number of situations where there has been a momentum behind a point of view. And I can remember one specifically when I was working for my family business a very long time ago, where the possibility came of taking over a company which was as big as us. And the momentum built up behind this. We were terrifically enthusiastic, including me, to do this. And I mean, in retrospect, this was an incredibly risky thing to do. Luckily, we had those involved who were wiser heads who said, well, we need some fallback here and some guarantees in case this goes wrong. So the notion of saying, let's be realistic about this seems to me extremely valuable, because everybody loves being involved in something where people are swept up with enthusiasm and they can hardly wait to get on with it, and it's fantastic, and isn't it going to be wonderful? It's going to transform our lives. I mean, it's a great feeling. And I'm not saying that isn't, a great thing to have in an organization. But in terms of saying, where does the quality of judgment play into this? It is, all right, we are very enthusiastic. Are we being so swept up we haven't thought about things we should have thought about? So that's the kind of approach I'm suggesting.
Got it. And of the various things you discovered in your research about judgment, Andrew, are there one or two things that surprised you the most in terms of what you started or where you started out and where you netted out in terms of your understanding of the topic?
I think what struck me is it goes back to the original reason why I started working on this, which is, why is it that something that is seen as so important in so many areas of life, and I've mentioned that I worked in government and academic life and commercial life, and I've been on the boards of many companies and many organizations. I've seen them from the inside as well. And here at the London Business School, I meet people from all over the world, from many different areas. Why is it that this quality, seen as so important, is not recognized? And why don't people spend more time thinking about it and trying to improve it? That has been a continuing surprise for me. And it provides a very, very exciting incentive for me to do this work.
Got it. And given what you've learned over the last few years, Andrew, where are you focusing your time and attention now in the context of studying judgment further?
Well, I'm working through a number of implications of providing a framework of this kind. So at the moment, I'm just completing work on professional judgment. That's to say, all professions have an important element, which is to say they provide professional judgment. That's a lot of what they do. And with the arrival of artificial intelligence, a lot of the detailed work of professions won't be there anymore. And my sense is that professions will be left with primarily the delivery of professional judgment. I'm working on artificial intelligence itself. I'm working on the question, can a machine exercise judgment? Because that seems to me to have implications at a micro level for organizations and also for economies in terms of what jobs will be available. And I'm going on then to work on boards. Can boards collectively exercise judgment? What does that mean? And finally, I'm going to work on appraisal and hiring to look at the questions of what one needs perhaps to ask in hiring people and appraising them. So I've got a full agenda.
That's the end of the conversation we recorded in February 2020. Now we move on to the conversation that we recorded a couple of days back in July 2020. Andrew, great to have you back at the Play to Potential podcast, although in strange times.
Well, I'm delighted to be back again.
And Andrew, we spoke a few weeks earlier about your work in judgment. But given we're going through COVID-19, I thought I'll take the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you to understand how your research plays out or how it can help us make better decisions in these times. So how does one think about judgment when there are so many unknown unknowns, as is the case with COVID-19, Andrew?
Well, I believe that having a framework to consider these difficult choices is very helpful because granted there are so many elements that are simply unknown. How is one to make sense of all this? So my hope is that by applying a framework, one can reduce one's personal anxiety and professional anxiety and make choices that are carefully considered. This also means looking at the risks, and I believe that assessing risk is an essential part of the good judgment process.
Mm-hmm. And specifically, last time when we spoke about the 6-step process that you spoke about around exercising good judgment. Any particular steps you would call people's attention to as we think about judgment in these times, Andrew?
Well, I hope that all the aspects are relevant because if I think of each of the steps, the business about listening and reading, I mean, there's a bit of a tendency perhaps to blot out the things that one doesn't like. If one's an optimist, one doesn't listen to the more pessimistic side and vice versa. I think in terms of trust, it's an important element. Who does one trust to give one advice here? And we've seen some remarkably poor advice given, I think, on the world stage. And also, does one trust what one reads? The figures, the statistics look very doubtful in a number of cases. In terms of experience, I would say that there's been a lot to learn from the experience of other countries. And you could argue that the Asian countries in general have done better than Western Europe and the United States because they've had more experience, and MERS in particular, which didn't affect the rest of the world in quite the same way, was nearer. I think, Europe and the United States should have learnt more from Asia in that way. In terms of one's feelings and so on, I think it's very easy to get swept along by a sense of anxiety or panic and whatever it is, and one has to realize that that's going on. The choice is complicated, and we need to make sure that the process that we bring all these things together in making our judgment is a sound one. And finally, there's the question of actually delivering. So a lot of countries have found that they've made a choice to do something, they've not been able to deliver it. So I think each of the stages of the judgment framework is applicable and has been applicable during this crisis.
Mm-hmm. And when you look around, Andrew, leaders, whether it's business leaders or government leaders or other individuals in other domains of life, where are you seeing leaders trip up in the way they're going about exercising judgment? Where are the missed opportunities from your vantage point?
Well, I mentioned the fact that I think that advisors and numbers sometimes need to be questioned more than they have been. I think that sometimes people have taken rather on faith the advice they've been given, and they've taken the numbers. And neither of those, it's turned out, have been very reliable. Sometimes not using the relevant experience, and I mentioned the Asia-Europe-America relationship. Sometimes I think people have not waited for long enough to get the necessary information before plunging in and doing something. And sometimes public figures have not followed their own instructions and advice with disastrous consequences. So those are the kinds of things I think where there have been slip-ups and missed opportunities. But I should say, you would expect that at a time like this. I think that, I'm speaking here about how they might have done better. But I think one has to understand in these circumstances that getting everything absolutely right is also unrealistic.
It's so true, Andrew. And sometimes it's hard even knowing what is right? What, given the circumstances, it's difficult to have a reference point against which we conclude if we are moving in the right direction or not. So I guess the related question I had, Andrew, was, one of the elements you talk about is experience. But in this case, we are actually dealing with a once-in-a-lifetime situation for a lot of people, where there are no markers, no real past playbook to work with. So how does one make decisions? How does one exercise judgment when one deals with a once-in-a-lifetime kind of situation, which is sort of where there's no anchor or reference point?
Well, I've been through the fact that simply having a framework and going through a number of steps to make sure that one has thought about things is really important. And this doesn't have to be something that takes weeks or months. I mean, we have to make a lot of judgments very quickly, but still just thinking about the question about, do I believe this information? What are my feelings? These are very important elements. But one particular fact I would bring out, which is very much part of my judgment framework, is to do with risk. And I think it's about acknowledging the fact that risk is there, bringing it into the open, being frank about it, acknowledging what this is, and acknowledging that in taking any judgment, it's going to be a balance, and the balance involves risk. So that's what I would particularly emphasize.
And when you say risk, are there certain dimensions of risk you have in mind, Andrew? Could you sort of elaborate on that?
Well, if I think, for example, of the speed of decision-taking, the risk of waiting as opposed to taking a quicker decision, and we've seen some countries apparently do better than that than others. We've seen also the question of consequences. The current debate in many countries about the trade-off between health and economic welfare, and so on. So that's another kind of element there. And again, there's no absolutes here. One is trading off risks here, and risks and consequences where one doesn't always know the consequences. And simply having that process transparent and in the open seems to me a huge benefit, rather than just sort of floundering around and guessing.
And as we look around, Andrew, who are the people that inspire you? People that you see exercising good judgment in these times? Any examples that come to mind that you can share as we think about exercising good judgment? Sometimes it's good to have a few people as markers of what good looks like. So any individuals that stand out for you?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's very important to get good examples and not just problems and disasters and issues. So I would, just picking a few at random, I would mark out the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who seems to me to have got the tone right in addressing the issues surrounding her country. And I thought that was very good judgment in the way in which she decided to communicate and explain things. I would say, if you're laying people off and if you're asking for sacrifices from your employees, it seems to me the bosses, who have taken pay cuts in solidarity with their workforce, I think that was, again, an example of very good judgment in terms of understanding what the implications are. I just take an example of some companies. I've been watching very closely how companies have been forecasting the future. And some have said, we won't open till September, or, we have no idea what's going on. The companies that have done this best, it seems to me, are those who have said, look, we have 2 or 3 scenarios here. This is what they are. And here's a more optimistic one and a more pessimistic one, the middle one. And at the moment, we are on this particular scenario, and we will be keeping an eye open to see where we go. Now, this gives a very good idea of the dimensions of uncertainty for the shareholder audiences. So I thought that was a good example. And finally, it seems to be organizations who have realized that this is a great opportunity for change, as any crisis is. And, for example, medical remote consultation has taken off, remote learning has taken off. So these are the kinds of examples where people have exercised good judgment in saying, this is a problem, it's a crisis, all right, so how do we make the most of it? So those are a few examples, it seems to me, of people getting it right.
And maybe just coming back to Jacinda Ardern, Andrew, actually, interestingly enough, one of my earlier guests, a lady called Jennifer Garvey Berger, who was on the podcast, she also mentioned Jacinda as a role model. I wanted to understand what you had in mind when you said tone. Could you expand on that in terms of getting the tone right? It's a very nuanced point, because it's not just about what you decide, but it's about the tone with which you carry out whatever you decide. So if you could expand on what you had in mind when you said that.
Yes, and it links to my more general point about exercising judgment. This is not just about big decisions. And I give the example of chief executives sending out memos to their employees. Now, most of the ones that I've seen in my life sound terrible. They are patronizing, or they are obscure, or there's something odd about it. And I've been very impressed by a few people I've seen who have sent out memos that are straight to their employees, that carry credibility. So that is very much, it seems to me, the tone here. It's somebody being straight, setting out what the difficulties are, setting out what the issues are, but explaining to why they are somebody who can be trusted, who've looked through at the implications, and you kind of have a feeling that they know what they're talking about. And that seems to me, for a leader, a very important quality.
Got it. Andrew, I think these are great insights around COVID-19. Anything else in your mind in the context of judgment during these times that I may not have explicitly touched upon?
No, I do think that it has illustrated how much, in a sense, how much easier it is if you think about difficult choices in a more structured way. We all have difficulty with choices that are particularly in unprecedented times. And so I'm encouraged by the fact that applying a framework to one's judgments, I believe, actually gives one a better chance of getting it right. It doesn't guarantee it, but it gives you a better chance.
Got it. Andrew, as always, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening and for your time and attention. Hope you found the conversation purposeful. Of the various things that Andrew spoke about, if there's one thing I see leaders trip up, especially when it comes to their transitions, is in questioning the solution set offered. I feel too many people fall victim to the notion of what you see is what there is. As Herminia Ibarra, one of the leading thinkers in transition, calls it out, they run the risk of foreclosure based on limited aperture of possibilities considered. I recently wrote a post on LinkedIn titled, "Are you seeing what is not visible?" You might find that interesting, especially if you're at some sort of career crossroads. If you're seeking value from the podcast, I'd urge you to pause and pay it forward to Antarang Foundation, a not-for-profit based in Mumbai that works with children from challenging backgrounds and helps them acquire key life skills and enables them to find jobs. These are challenging times we are going through, and your help will mean a lot. You can know more at the Pay It Forward section at playtopotential.com. To know more about the coaching, transition, and leadership advisory work I do, please visit the About the Host section at playtopotential.com. Bye now.